Superiore Sant'Anna. He's well known, but I can just say that he works as an analyst at the OECD and he contributes there to the PISA project. He's going to present us a speech entitled What Role for Large-Scale Assessments in an Age of Rapid Technological Change. So please, Francesco.
Thank you, and let me start by introducing this talk by saying that this is based on joint work. It's a reflection which I conducted together with Francesco, which is also well known by many of you. We hope to publish this in an edited book coming out next year. I also need to thank Patrizia and Roberto for the invitation and for the opportunity to present and discuss this work with you, but also for the opportunity to listen to the good work and that many of you are doing and to learn about many initiatives in Italy. My talk has essentially two parts. A brief history of the future, modestly entitled, and what this implies for large-scale assessments. But before that, I would like to paint a bit the scene and with a short preamble, and I have a short conclusion at the end on trust. And I think it nicely connects to a lot of things that Thierry has been mentioning this morning about the need to go well beyond numbers and statistics. So the preamble. Just to be clear on what we're talking about, large-scale assessments are assessments that measure the knowledge and skills of entire cohorts of students, so not individual assessments, or of the whole working age population. Someone had mentioned PIAC before. They do play a key role in policy making, as we have learned. They do reinforce public accountability, they help monitor global development goals, they facilitate international peer learning for policymakers. Like any assessment, there is an interdependence between the context in which it takes place and the goals that it tries to assess and the assessment itself. So educational assessments in some way represent statements about what we want students to know and learn. By putting something on the assessment, we say this is what we expect students to know by the end of secondary school or by the end of primary school. Now this obviously depends on the context, but it also influences the context. In fact, any assessment does, whether it is large scale, small scale, but certainly large scale assessment too, and even more so the ones that I'm more familiar with, which are the OECD's assessment, which really have a strong dependence on policy making from the start. So when you use educational assessment to evaluate the effectiveness of schools or to assess whether students meet expected learning standards, as a result, you influence what teachers do and what students learn. Educational assessments need to be wary of this relation of reciprocal dependence, which implies, for what I'm going to talk about, that if assessments do not involve at the same pace as changes in teaching and learning, for example, then it is very difficult to sustain innovations in teaching and learning, because we will keep teaching to the same assessments, which will hold back innovation. Now, when we bring this to a bigger scale of large-scale assessments, and particularly international large-scale assessments like the ones I will be talking about, OECD-led assessments such as PISA and PIAC, the OECD's role is to provide countries with international comparative data to inform the decisions of governments and of other stakeholders about education and skills policies. The development and implementation of these studies is highly sensitive to the needs of policymakers. So the studies offers participants insights into the results of their policies, but it also influences the next policies that are going to put in place. So the development, implementation, interpretation is influenced by the economic, political, and social and technological context in which they occur, and in turn they influence all these aspects by inspiring policy making. So the same conclusion applies as in schools, but in the classroom at this kind of country level, that if you don't develop assessments that remain attuned to the changing circumstances, then not only will we risk that they lose relevance, but maybe I'm overstating the power of assessments here, but I think we risk really holding back the necessary adaptations required for individuals and societies to thrive in these new circumstances. So, in a nutshell, I wouldn't find better than this to summarize the message. The times, they are changing. They have been, at least since Bob Dylan wrote these lines, and they are probably this change is probably accelerating as much as we know. And like in this famous song, if we don't start swimming, then we'll sink like a stone. So we as teachers and assessment specialists, we need to start swimming. Sometimes we need to follow the current, sometimes we need to resist certain fashions, but we cannot afford complacency or afford to remain static in the wake of these changing circumstances. Otherwise, we fail. So, moving into this futurology part of my talk, which is not what I'm most familiar with. I'm most familiar with presenting results of the past and data, but this is obviously somewhat speculative. But it is definitely rests on data and on analysis done also by others, not just the OECD. I'm going to touch on 3 related trends, but mainly on the technological change. And in the past, there has been obviously always technological change, but the pace of technological change is accelerating now. And it's also interacting with these 2 other demographic trends, aging and increasing cross-border mobilities. And together, this has a lot of implications for what we are required to learn, how we are required to learn, where we will learn, how we develop skills, and how we lose skills over time. One could say that in the past 30 years, there has been change, policy priorities have evolved, but not to the extent of really prompting significant redesign of large-scale assessment programs. The PISA that we have today is to a large extent the PISA that we had 20 years ago. The TIMSS that we have today is to a large extent similar. The way it is administered, the way it is delivered, and that has some positives to it. But during the years ahead, it is possible that the landscape will change much more dramatically. Several trends, so these mega trends, will continue to drive change in society, and in turn they will require changes in the design, in the implementation, and in the analysis of large-scale assessments. Of course, the main change that we are witnessing is the role of digital technologies. When we say the technological change, we refer to the digitalization of our societies. And then I like to have some numbers in my presentation when I talk about these broad subjects. When we look at PISA data from 2009, 15% of families across the OECD did not have access to the internet. So a lot did, a lot did not. When you look at other areas of OECD data collection, there were 35 mobile data subscriptions per 100 inhabitants. That's just 10 years ago. The broadband infrastructure was still quite limited. So even just by counting, we see that there's a lot of change happened in just 10 years. Now less than 5% of families do not have access to the internet in 2018. The number of mobile broadband subscriptions has been multiplied by 3. There's more broadband subscriptions than inhabitants in OECD countries. We now do everything on the go. Often with our mobile phones, we do traditional mobile communication, obviously phone, TV, radio, publishing. This is now consumed through digital channels, but also more and more we do shopping online. We just have survived Black Friday. Maybe the planet has not. We have survived the planet. We do banking. We do finance. It's done online. The quality of services that are delivered online is changing so rapidly that adoption is going even faster than these numbers can show. Now, already in the past 30 years, what people do at work has changed quite a lot. So this is even older data. This stops in 2009. So today's workplaces and daily lives, they already require individuals mostly to solve non-routine problems. This is a famous analysis by author Levy and Morley. which was updated by Author and Price in 2010, I think, and the original article is from 2003, and it shows very compellingly that we used to have a lot of workers doing routine manual work. That has been declining at least since 1970. We used to have workers doing non-routine manual work. That's been declining even faster, and even before that. Now, routine cognitive tasks have first increased but then declined also very fast as machines started taking over many of these accounting jobs and secretarial jobs, for example. What is left is workers doing many more non-routine analytic tasks and perhaps even to a greater extent non-routine interpersonal tasks, where the interaction with other human beings is key to the tasks themselves. So this trend is not going to stop, and in fact many people are arguing that what we used to classify as non-routine analytic is more and more becoming sufficiently routine for machines to perform, that intelligent machines equipped with artificial intelligence, machine learning, will start taking over some of these tasks. So this social and this transformation in what people do in jobs, they obviously have changed the demand for skills, for what we need to equip people. Now, of course, not everything is dark, and I think ever since the Industrial Revolution there have been fears of technology-induced job losses. It's been common. You're very familiar probably with the Luddites and the rage against the machines that they brought to the Industrial Revolution. But despite such fears, we've fared pretty well, in fact. Employment in OECD countries has grown steadily over the past decades. We've been able to create a place in the labor market, in the formal labor market, if you take a century-wide perspective, for many more women, for many older people. We've created a lot of jobs in OECD countries. However, at this time, there are actually a number of others that have argued that the speed of technological change and the intensity of progress is increasing, and this new wave of transformation may have more disruptive consequences for workers. So certainly many new and productive and rewarding forms of work are being created as part of the digital transformation. Now, at the same time, many jobs have disappeared, and more are likely to go in the future. But perhaps the bigger transformation is that even the jobs that will stay there, many of them will change quite decisively, what is implied. 32% of jobs, according to a recent OECD work paper, face major changes in the tasks required in their job, and consequently in the skills they will need to do their jobs. Now, these workers who are currently working in these occupations, they will need to significantly adapt to succeed in the new digitally enabled work environment. And then there's another 14% of workers whose jobs are going to disappear, and for them it's even more dramatic. And when we think of the young people, what we are preparing them for, well, if they look only at the jobs that their parents are doing, or maybe the friends of their parents, then half of these jobs will not exist in the same fashion once they reach the labor market. So we need to start preparing children for a future that they cannot simply imagine by looking at what's around them today. What is required? Most jobs in the future, they will certainly require the capacity to manage information and solve problems using computers, using digital technologies. There's no doubt. But at the same time, as ICT applications are certainly fundamental to operate in the workplace, what they will encounter in 10 years, the students who are currently, say, in lower secondary school, are not the same applications that are there today. So there's no point in preparing them to the applications of today so much. The ICT hardware, software and infrastructure, they do change at a rapid pace, and users must be able to adapt and to adjust quickly to new ICT devices and applications that continually change in functionality. So digital technologies and the resulting disruptions in job markets, they also bring important changes and opportunities in the way education itself is delivered. The accelerating nature of technological change and potentially the disruptive impact of the demand for basic skills of new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, imply at the minimum the need to establish a solid system of lifelong learning, and also perhaps to redefine the role of school within that system. Skills that are acquired at the beginning of one's working life, they cannot be assumed to remain relevant over an increasingly long lifespan. So let me say a few more words about in what ways digital transformation is redefining all skills. Technological innovations do not only mean that we need to learn how to use technological devices or to operate digital technology efficiently. They are also profoundly reshaping the way in which individuals access, analyze, and communicate information. The digital revolution has definitely sharply changed and increased the amount of information that individuals can access anytime and anywhere. So the wording by McLuhan, the medium is the message, which was applied to electric media in the 60s, now applies even more to digital media. This is changing the way we exchange information in the 21st century. What students need to be equipped with, what adults need to have, is strategies to sort, evaluate, prioritize information when there's an overwhelming amount of it, capacity for self-regulation, to persist in difficult tasks, abilities to separate information into facts, opinions, falsehoods. This word has much less intermediation between the author and the recipient of the message, and also perhaps awareness of the algorithms that may limit exposure to dissenting information and opinion. So moving forward, digitalization and in particular the application of machine learning, artificial intelligence technologies may have even more profound implications, and they yield the promise of opening up unknown possibilities for the humans. In fact, such technologies, they may not only allow individuals to change their environment to a much higher degree than what was previously possible, perhaps for better, perhaps for worse, hence the need for values and ethics as well. They will not only complement humans in the functions that they perform, but like other technological innovations in the past, like the most significant of them, the invention of writing system or the printing press, they will actually enhance capacities of human beings and change the very nature of how we, of consciousness, of how we store information, how we communicate, and our relation to knowledge. Smart machines, biotech, they can make people smarter, and they can increase our sensory capacities to an extent that we can probably hardly imagine sometimes today. And that obviously will have implications for how we should prepare ourselves for the future. Now, other trends. Technological change has always been a strong driver of societal change through human history. It is accelerating, as I mentioned before, but several trends, many of which are related. Some of them are in fact arguably the effect of past technological advances. And they may have been initially related to technological advances. They are now interacting also with it and have acquired their own dynamics. And they cannot be expected over a horizon of 20 to 30 years to exert strong influence on what the world will look like in the future. So the two trends I want to mention here briefly are population aging and international migration. The population of the world and of industrialized countries of the OECD is steadily aging. If you take the OECD average, there were 16% of people above 65 in 2015. This is projected to increase to 25% by 2050. The proportion above 80 is doubling, or more than doubling in the same time span. And the proportion of people below 15 is diminishing. Now, what this means for skill policies is that, well, to sustain the pension system, we already know that probably we need to work for a longer period of time. So we are going to have longer careers than our fathers and our grandfathers. Individuals will remain active in the labor market for longer, and some worry that this can have negative effects on aggregate productivity. Labor productivity may decline, and indeed, if you look at the current adult surveys, although there are differences between countries, and although they only focus on certain types of skills, maybe not on all kinds of skills, it is clear that older cohorts tend to have lower skills in PIAC, and that part of that is an age effect. There is loss of skill currently. In the past, there has been loss of skill in the over the lifespan. So we need better instruments to understand how human capital is accumulated, but also how it is lost over the lifespan. And it is crucial to have these instruments to address the challenges of population aging and to make sure that we don't lose critical capacities too fast, to improve the effectiveness of policies that are aimed to equip individuals with skills needed at work and thrive in society in the presence of rapid change. Immigrants are another challenge for skill policies. Now, the share of immigrants in OECD countries has been growing. Italy is following certainly the same trend as many other OECD countries in this respect. It is also becoming more diverse. Even traditional countries of immigration, actually, they used to have immigration from few source countries. They now have much more diversified inflows of immigrants. Globally, it is particularly immigration from Asia that is actually on the rise. If you think in the 1980s, China did not appear among the main source countries of skilled immigrants to any countries of the OECD. Today, there's a lot of skilled immigration from China to Australia, to Canada, to the United States, and soon possibly also to Europe. So increases in the number of and diversity of immigrants will require that host communities upgrade their integration policies and programs to support the learning of the host country language in the first place, but also to ensure that the range of skills that immigrants bring with them when they immigrate are rapidly activated in the local labor market and recognized in the host country's markets. So, turning to the second part and being a bit more concrete proposals about what needs to change for large-scale assessments. Let me introduce this part by saying that over the past century, I think formal learning institutions, mainly schools but also universities, they have changed from serving the few to serving the many. And at the same time, they have become the main system in which children are socialized and youth, and to license professionals. School-based assessments are in fact very much born within that system. So if you think of PISA, we assess only children who are at school in certain grades, even though it has an age-based definition. And in some countries we are still not assessing the entire cohort, because not the entire cohort of children participates in education at age 15. But perhaps moving into the future, we may ask ourselves whether schools are still going to remain the main institution. There is no doubt that in the near future, schools and universities as we know them, they will remain important in providing space and opportunity for learning, but they may definitely lose their quasi-monopoly and may have to interact and collaborate increasingly with other channels and modes of learning. We have always learned also from the family, from the community, from the workplace for older students. They always have probably contributed more to skills than has been recognized by the credentials that they determined. Much of that has been informal and non-formal because it doesn't provide credentials, but it's definitely been learning. But in the near future, it is well possible that the limit between the formal and the informal is going to be much more blurred. And perhaps the weight of the informal and non-formal sectors are going to increase in terms of individuals' biographies of learning. In the coming years, in particular, technology increasingly will create new channels for human learning outside of institutional frameworks, complementing and sometimes competing with the formal and traditional ones. Employers will create also new modes of certifying skills, perhaps competing with the certifications delivered by the school system. Training and informal learning at the workplace will probably acquire new value. If you think of lifelong learning, that is where adults learn most, are going to acquire most of their new skills. So anticipating evolving economic, social, political and technological landscape and ensuring that large-scale assessments take up this challenge is going to be difficult. So education, in a sense, always fulfills a double role. On the one hand, transmitting the heritage of the past, on the other hand, preparing young people for the future. Now these two are going to come increasingly perhaps in tension, and education as an institution is ridden with these tensions forever between tradition and innovation. So I think this is a particular point in time where we need to think seriously about how to ensure that both goals are given sufficient attention in the assessments of learning that we are conducting. So how can large-scale assessments weather the change? The technological and demographic changes that are detailed above, they certainly also determine a number of opportunities, in addition to the challenges I mentioned, for large-scale assessments. Now, in highlighting some strategies, responses, and actions that we can take to change large-scale assessments, I'm going to classify them into three phases, which are to plan, to absorb, and to adapt. So to plan means recognizing that technological and demographic transformations require changes for which adequate resources and decision-making mechanisms need to be put in place. Large-scale assessments may need to invest perhaps more than in the past in research and development to be able to identify solutions to emerging needs. And often these solutions in fact exist within small-scale assessment or within research-based endeavors, but they are being developed. They have been pioneered in the context of local initiatives, of small-scale research projects. Still, we need to invest significant resources to mobilize, to identify how these solutions can be tested and brought to scales in large-scale assessments, particularly in international assessments like the ones the OECD does, which involve different languages, different cultural backgrounds, tight deadlines, and standardized administration protocols. Preparation may also involve development of explicit and debate around explicit mid-term and long-term strategies based on foresight exercises and other future-oriented tools to ensure that the different stakeholders are involved in the process of redesigning future assessments. The second strategy, the second set of actions has to do with absorbing what can be taken, the good opportunities, and absorbing the change, making sure that we remain attuned to the change, to the changing circumstances. So first thing to do is leverage the change to satisfy existing needs. For any statistical exercise, I think some of the quality indicators for any statistical exercise are the relevance of it, the accuracy of the data it provides, the credibility of the data, the timeliness, the efficiency. I think there are, including at this conference, there are several examples which show how, for instance, computer-based assessments can be leveraged to increase the amount of feedback that's given to users, to make sure that we are more efficient in the data collection, to increase the accuracy. We can standardize the conditions of administrations to a much greater extent in computer-based assessment and paper-based assessment. So there are definitely technological opportunities that are open to us to respond to these needs, which are not going to vanish, of course, in this great new world. I want to spend a bit more time on the need for relevance, though, and what opportunities exist to address this. I think the opportunities here are twofold. First, rethinking how the skills that we are currently assessing should be assessed in the future, in ways that are more authentic and more relevant to the ways people use these skills in context, in real life context. And secondly, the way you can remain relevant to this need of preparing policymakers for difficult decisions about skill policies by also expanding the range of skills that we assess. Now, at the OECD and in PISA, we are investing each cycle quite extensive resources on rethinking the assessment of foundation skills, and I'm going to bring you some examples of the direction we've been taking in the past from the reading and science assessments in PISA. So this is, for example, a new PISA unit which was released this year, and results from this unit are going to be released in a couple of days. I'm not going to tell you about the results. I want to bring your attention, and I'm very much aware that you cannot read anything on this slide, probably. It just shows you the layout. But I also have a nice magnifier tool here, which tells you, puts the spotlight on a key sentence in the question here. So, for instance, in this reading comprehension task, we ask students, after reading the three sources, what do you think caused the disappearance of the large trees? So this is new in PISA, and is reflects the new framework for assessing reading comprehension in PISA in first a simple way, the fact that we have multiple texts now. We have introduced multiple text units in 2018, where previously we had just one stimulus text and then a series of questions on that text, and then we move to another stimulus text and so on. So as here in the sentence, you say, read the three texts and then integrate what you have read to explain what caused the disappearance of the large trees. You don't need to know necessarily what this is about. But there were many other examples where we asked students to search for information across multiple sources, where we asked students to integrate information across text and generate conclusions, inferences from them. Or perhaps related to a critical debate currently, assessing the quality and the credibility of sources or handling conflict across sources. Because in this, particularly in online reading, when you search for information online, it is not uncommon that you will find contradictory information. It is not uncommon that you will read about a topic that you don't know much about, and you would need to, and you don't know the author, and you don't know much about where the information comes from, and yet you need to do yourself those judgments of quality, credibility of the text and of the source in order to determine the best use you can make of it. So we had new text formats such as blogs, such as online forums that were introduced, and I'm sure that in 10 years when we will repeat, or actually in 8 years when we will repeat this exercise, this will already look outdated. So we need to constantly update these assessments. And we had both obviously multiple choice and selected response items in PISA. Now perhaps the domain, so even in reading, which perhaps could also almost be thought in PISA as much broader than just reading. It's really about information literacy with text, with accessing information from text and working with information from text. There is a lot of change happening, but perhaps the domain where this is more evident, even in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the guidelines and how they are evolving, is science. Contemporary science standards, like the United States Next Generation Standards, for example, the German Bildungsstandard, they do emphasize that the central goal of science education is not just to learn about the natural world, but to be able to use the knowledge of the natural world to make sense of it. And also of technological applications, of course. In other words, students should be able to demonstrate knowledge in use, not just knowledge, by integrating disciplinary knowledge with scientific practices, such as modeling, or using evidence-based explanation, using argumentation, designing investigations themselves, test hypotheses, analyzing results, constructing explanations from the data they have collected. So the contemporary science curricula, they are not just about knowledge of science, they're a lot about preparing students to do science in order to understand what scientists do and to critically consume it. Not because we need to prepare everyone to become a scientist. There's still probably going to be only perhaps 15% who are working in science-related occupations in the future, but because science is such an important determinant of changes that are going to impact everyone as citizens and as consumers, for example. So assessment tasks in that context are expected to mimic as much as possible authentic practice of scientists, from novice level to expert level. And it is only through technology that we will probably be able to assess these aspects of science competence. So we started doing some of this, and I think a lot more can be done, in fact. With PISA 2015, we introduced, for example, this kind of task. Here the question was, I'm selecting some words from the question here, stand here. The student was asked to execute a simulation. And then the data would appear in this right-hand side sort of spreadsheet. Based on that data, what they had to say, what is the effect of something on something else? Here it was about temperature, I think, on the amount of sweating when you run in hot weather. I think that was the question here. And then select data. Make sure that you're using an argument to show that your understanding, but also that you can connect that understanding to what you have learned in class, to some theories about what is biological, physiological, I should say, mechanisms of the human body. So this is a much broader concept of science literacy probably than we were used to, and it is only through the use of technology, computer-based assessments, that we were able to introduce some of these tasks. So we can leverage this to make our assessments more authentic and more true to what we expect students to be able to do in the future. But we can also leverage technology to assess new skills which we didn't assess previously. What the difficulty here is probably to decide what to assess. Now, inevitably we must start with some idea of how future trends will affect the demand for people skills. And there's plenty of frameworks for 21st century skills which we can draw upon. Now, some of them are a bit abstract. Some of these groupings, like cognitive skills, intrapersonal, interpersonal competence, they are relevant in any context and in most situations in which individuals are doing tasks. Other groupings, they do refer not to completely distinct skills, not really to completely distinct skills, but rather to what individuals are able to do in specific contexts. And I think that is a more promising avenue to go for. For example, if you think of digital literacy competences, these are the competences that are relevant in a digital context. Or if you think of collaborative competences, these are competences that are relevant in a social context in which you interact with others, or where you have to demonstrate civic or citizenship competences in a context relevant to that. So this will be multidimensional constructs inevitably. It is not just one skill that is mobilized in this context. So we need to develop methods to deal with this multidimensionality, but I think it will be much more easy and authentic and relevant to develop assessments based on a context-related definition of what is assessed than based on abstract categorizations. So the last phase, adaptation, is the most challenging one. This refers to perhaps rethinking the long-term changes in design, instrumentation and analysis tools, thinking them in a context that's maybe radically changed by technological and social change. This may involve, for example, altering significantly the structure and key parameters of the assessment programs, not only what is assessed, as I mentioned before, but also who, where, how often. because as I mentioned before, as learning systems expand in time to involve lifelong learning, but also in space, blurring the limits between the formal and the informal, large-scale assessments that focus only on youth and only on schools will need to adapt in order to remain relevant guides for policies and also capture the different forms of learning and their outcomes. As schools progressively erode as key players in the development of skills due to the longer life expectancies and the rapid technological change, we may need to move perhaps away or to complement school-based assessment as the primary tool to evaluate the quality of education systems. And on the other hand, the fact that skills cannot be considered acquired once and for all, they are subject themselves to skill loss and obsolescence, we will need individuals to go through phases of reskilling. This will increase probably the appetite to embed large-scale assessment programs within longitudinal designs, which can capture crucial information on transitions and flows, in addition to the stocks that we are currently measuring. Another fundamental change may concern the frequency and periodicity of the surveys that we conduct. The administration, in highly spaced time intervals at high levels of analysis, such as countries or in large regions, may not be well suited to support the decision making at the local level following technologically driven disruption or following the large inflow of new arrivals because of international migration. So in that sense, we need to become much more responsive to specific demands for local or perhaps ad hoc assessments which remain linked to the cohort-wide assessments conducted at scale. So concluding my talk, I think using a different metaphor that in education we must keep pedaling or otherwise we will fall. But moving forward is definitely hard without trust in the institution. Changing an institution is definitely very challenging when there's lack of trust in the public. So overall trust is an ubiquitous ingredient in policy making across many governance systems, including education, whether it concerns accountability mechanisms, capacity building, or strategic thinking. Now, the paradox of trust in institutions and policy makings is that when there is lack of trust, there are often claims for greater transparency or for greater accountability, but you just shift the problem one step further, because then you need also to trust the accountability mechanism that is delivering this data. And that's the point also that was made in part by Thierry this morning. So large-scale assessments, they are unique tools to provide evidence in a low-trust environment, but they also are subject themselves to quite a lot of lack of trust and mistrust, which is directed towards the community involved in the development of large-scale assessments. And this erodes the very foundations of how large-scale assessments perform their functions. So I think, how can we respond to that? Increased knowledge, on the one hand, increased knowledge, communication of large-scale assessment, the awareness of the role they play in policy making is a bit double-edged. I mean, with that increased awareness comes also increased scrutiny into its methods, into its premises by the research community, but also by the general public. And we certainly must be open to that, but we must be prepared also for that. I think in the future, large-scale assessment will have to invest definitely adequate resources to build trust among stakeholders they serve, and also among the experts that they rely on for their operations. And to achieve this, events like this one are definitely important, where the methods are discussed openly, where the uses are discussed openly, where there is an exchange, where there is a feedback. There is not just one-way communication from those sitting up here to those in the public, but it goes all ways. We need to invest more in making the technical materials perhaps accessible and used by the research community, to invest more in ensuring that the information that details the rationale that guides the development of the assessment and the implementation and the analysis is made available in a format that is suitable for being accessed by anyone, and by also holding regular public consultations to ensure understanding and buy-in among stakeholders, including policymakers, and confirm that they continue to serve the public interest.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Questions? I would like to go on with questions step by step. Any question? Okay, please.
Giorgio Bolondi, University of Newton. At the beginning of your talk, you stated more or less that if an assessment system doesn't change according to or interfaced with the evolution of the system assessed, then it risks to stop or to interfere with the evolution of the system itself. And I believe that this is true also for example, for teacher assessment in its microsystem. So do you have evidence or data from PISA on how the evolution of PISA is helping to fostering change in teachers' assessments?
Teacher assessment, you mean classroom assessment? Well, not at scale. I think I confirm I confirm what you quoted me for. I think it is true that, and on the other hand, we certainly do have. We're aware that the introduction of PISA, but I think this is the general of competence-based assessment has changed. Practices on the ground has changed. This has trickled down to many. So it has been it has probably been a driver of some innovation. But I think it needs to. So perhaps in the beginning this was true. It was a revolution for many countries to conduct to think in terms of competences for everyone. To think of learning goals in that way, and that has changed not just policy making but also practice in many schools. Now currently I think we risk becoming perhaps prisoners of that first exercise if you don't keep changing as well, if you don't keep tuning ourselves to further changes in what kind of skills, competences are required in the future. And certainly some of that is going to proceed by trial and error as well. We started with the easiest, perhaps, domains and topics. As we move into more difficult domains and topics, we must not be too afraid of also stating the experimental nature of those
Even at
changes.
a very phenomenological level, for instance, introducing different kinds of technology in assessment is fostering introducing the technological assessment in classrooms. Do you have data from your countries?
I don't, but I think many in the room may have. So I think it will be an interesting discussion. I don't have data on this.
Other questions? I have one. I was wondering how much the increasing relevance of testing may lead to an increasing use of testing, so it is connected to what we're saying, use of testing for pupils allocation to schools, something that is happening in our country when you look at the transition from lower to upper secondary school, or to other opportunities, and I was wondering how you can connect this tendency with the need of trust towards test and accountability. If you have some reflections on this point.
I think that, well, ideally you want different tools for different goals, as Thierry said in the beginning. And I think it is, so what I mostly talked about is definitely about assessments which, so large-scale assessments, which tend to be low-stake for individuals and for schools. The stakes are maybe higher for policymakers at local or at national level, but so we need to make the design choices having in mind what are the stakes in the test. Now, there is a bit of a dependence, of course. I mean, all the testing. All the testing efforts, they benefit from the same technological advances, for example, and there may be spillovers from credentialing in the labor to testing in the school system, whether it is at classroom level, whether it's at school level, or at system level. But I do think we are talking of different things here, and the use of the test actually defines quite an important aspect of the test itself. So it's not the same test if it's used to take decisions like which school you can go to, or if it's taken to make decisions about skill policies at the country level. Probably greater differentiation in the tool is probably required and desired to avoid certain. Also to build trust in the, I mean, trust is really a fragile ingredient here, and adding a different function to a test that wasn't designed to fulfill it can have big reputational and trust downsides.
I think that you're right, definitely agree with you. On the other side, what we are seeing is that exactly there is this shift in the use of assessment from one function to another. So when you release data coming from testing, probably you do not can forecast in advance to what extent that data will be used for other purposes. So that's a crucial point.